Critic reality. Today we have a very special guest coming to us from Switzerland. We're just coming from Safnahúsið in Hverfisgata here in Reykjavík, where Ögmundur Jónasson invited us for a meeting for radical consideration, a meeting series. And with us this time was Alfred de Zayas, professor in a university in Genf, who has worked in the United Nations for many decades, has a wealth of experience, written books like The Human Rights Industry, Building a Just Order, and he's been the chairman of the PEN Association in Swiss. Hello, Alfred. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It was a great meeting, a great speech you gave and discussions that were created.
It was a good audience.
Yeah.
There were good questions from the audience. I like that.
Yeah, a full room. People are interested. It's a serious time we're living in. You've spent your life working within these international institutions that seek to, or are supposed to, protect human life, human dignity, stability in the world, to preserve justice, human rights. Can you tell us what is the situation with these institutions today?
Well, the institutions are very much under attack, and the institutions are very much undermined, very much penetrated. When I joined the United Nations back in 1980, it was a different world. We were a small team, and I worked together with Justice Jacob Müller of Iceland, and for 16 years he was my Socratic mentor, and I learned a lot from Jacob. And we were enthusiastic about the task. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has become, unfortunately, an industry. We're paper pushers, and we are cut and paste artists. We rely on old resolutions and old ideas, and there's not a single constructive and peacemaking strategy to keep us afloat. And that is no surprise that the United Nations and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have lost so much of their authority and of their credibility. Now, Jacob Müller and myself, we published a book back in 2009 called United Nations Human Rights Committee Case Law, the jurisprudence of this expert committee to which I dedicated more than 2 decades of my life, in which we produced really excellent jurisprudence to defend human dignity. And the Human Rights Committee, and also our book, was very much dedicated to defending the right to life, defending the right to disarmament, defending the right to our identities, to our human dignity. And today, the office and many non-governmental organizations are pushing what I would call business-friendly human rights. So there's very little emphasis on the right to education, on the right to education for peace, on the right to health and the right to clean water and sanitation. And the emphasis is on the right to property and the right, I would say even the right to be intransigent. And that is what we see in the case of Ukraine. The position taken by Jens Stoltenberg and NATO has been a hyper-intransigent position. We are obligated, all 193 states, members of the United Nations, are obligated to seek peaceful resolution of disputes. That means sitting down, having dialogue, putting forward a proposal for a modus vivendi, and not refusing to negotiate. Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter obligates us to seek solutions proactively. And we've seen since the coup d'etat in Kiev at Maidan in February of 2014, we have seen how NATO continues its campaign of expansion toward Russia and its campaign to arm all of Eastern Europe against Russia. Now, let's go back to 1986 here in Reykjavík, when Mikhail Gorbachev met with Ronald Reagan. This was the end of the Cold War. The Russians wanted to end the Cold War. The Russians wanted to essentially join the West. And not only Gorbachev, but Yeltsin and even Putin initially wanted to join the West, the European Union, NATO, everything. And what happened is that Bill Clinton blocked that. Bill Clinton was under the influence of neocons. Neocons are these ideologues, these fanatics in the United States who insist on maintaining American hegemony in the world, insist on the unipolar world. And Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote this infamous book called The Grand Chessboard, in which he lays out how to maintain this power. The neocons put out the Project for the New American Century. And you have these people like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and Victoria Nuland and Kagan and Richard Pearl, all of them planning how to control the world through the dollar, how to control the world through the abuse of the privileges that the United States had gradually built up since the Second World War. Now, this actually is a very aggressive policy. NATO wants to present itself in pastel colors as a defense alliance. It has nothing to do with defense. NATO was initially, when the Soviet Union was expansive, when the Soviet Union did present a threat, NATO had a legitimacy as a defense alliance. The moment that the Warsaw Pact was dismantled in 1991, and the moment that Gorbachev and Yeltsin and all the others wanted to be more American than Americans, there was no more enemy. But NATO said no, because NATO needed an enemy. NATO needed to create an enemy so as to justify its existence. And we've seen it in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, how the Russians have expressed their outrage over the breach of promises made by George H.W. Bush, that is George Bush father, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, who said, quote unquote, that NATO would not expand eastwards 1 single inch. Now, when a president, when a Secretary of State, when a foreign minister make an oral agreement, and this oral agreement is retained in the minutes of their reunions.
The notes.
And this is repeated again and again, as we know from the last American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock. When someone like George F. Kennan reminds us that breaking your word is dangerous. You're not alone in the world, and the other party that has been taken for a ride is going to respond in some way. The other party is in a situation that he feels threatened. Now, everybody has heard the narrative put out by NATO and the narrative put out by the Pentagon that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked. And that gets repeated again and again and again. And I say, you're insulting my intelligence because I cannot think of an invasion that has been more provoked than this one. And I cannot think of an invasion, which, of course, it is a violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. No question about that. Mm-hmm. But the provocation itself is also a violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4, because the UN Charter prohibits not only the use of force, but also the threat of the use of force. And how do you measure the threat of the use of force? Not whether you say, I am threatening you. It's been measured from the other side, whether the other party feels threatened, whether the other side has been given reason to feel that it is existentially menaced. And that is the situation. The Russian government in the 1990s, in the 2000s, at the time of the Maidan Putsch, had very clearly expressed their concern, their red lines, and say, you have promised not to come eastward, you have promised not to arm our neighbors. If you do so, you're threatening us. And this reminds me of 1962, when the Soviets put missiles in Cuba, and President John F. Kennedy threatened with nuclear war. And he made it very clear to Khrushchev that you'd better take those missiles away. We're not going to tolerate the missiles next to our shore. And the Soviets agreed, and they took them away, but it was a quid pro quo. You have to remember, it was not a one-way deal. The United States took its missiles away from Turkey, which were aiming Moscow and St. Petersburg. And the United States also promised not to interfere in the internal affairs of Cuba. So it was a modus vivendi.
It was a mutual agreement where both sides got something. The Soviet Union got the missiles away from Turkey, the missiles that were pointing at them, and the Americans got the missiles out of Cuba.
Well, and that is what diplomacy is about. Diplomacy is about negotiating. I give you something, you give me something. It's not a one-way street. The American approach, the hegemonial approach, is we tell you how it goes, and then you'd better accept it. And unfortunately, in the multipolar world that is emerging right now, the United States can tell the Indian Prime Minister Modi whatever the United States wants to say, and Modi will smile at us and say, go jump in the lake. And the same thing with Xi Jinping, and the same thing with the Russians. But I am reminded of John F. Kennedy's very important speech to students graduating American University in June 1963. That was about 6 months before he was assassinated. And in this fantastic speech, which you can get in the internet in the JFK library, he said this: above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the whole world. End of quote. And I would go beyond that. It's not a bankruptcy of policy alone. It's a bankruptcy of our values. It's a bankruptcy of our beliefs. It is a betrayal of the United States Constitution. It's a betrayal of the United Nations Charter. And Joe Biden has been driving Putin to the edge. And if Russia feels existentially threatened, or even if American missiles given to Zelensky are used to hit Moscow and St. Petersburg, those missiles can only be used with American intel, can only be used with American satellites, etc. And this is super complicated, and it's mostly encrypted. And the only way to shoot these missiles is through direct American involvement. That is, the Ukrainians can send drones and all sorts of things by themselves. But these missiles being delivered now to Ukraine can only be operational through direct NATO involvement, which means NATO is directly at war with Russia. Now, the danger is huge. And Putin has said it. Lavrov has said it. Medvedev has said it. I mean, these people are not kidding. They are not bluffing. And I want to live on. And I've told my friends in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and I know many ambassadors with whom I've spoken, and say, look, because of this American, NATO, Ukrainian, European querelle, you, Latin Americans, Africans, and Asians, are not going to suffer apocalypse. I mean, you're not interested in the question whether Crimea is in Russia or in Ukraine. You have other worries. You have other priorities. And it is an arrogance of incredible magnitude for the West to put the entire world at risk because of its intransigence, because of its refusal to end this stupid war now with an immediate ceasefire followed by reasonable dialogue, reasonable quid pro quo, reasonable modus vivendi. And the Chinese, back in 2022, produced a 12-point plan, which I have studied. It is pragmatic, it is reasonable, it is balanced. Zelensky rejected it. Now, the Chinese and the Brazilians have produced a new 6-point plan. It is reasonable, it is pragmatic, it is implementable. It's been rejected. I myself produced a 10-point plan. I mean, I have a plan of action for peace, and I called it my blueprint for peace in Ukraine, and I've published it in various journals. Nobody even looks at it. I mean, I'm a nobody. But the African presidents, they went to Kiev and they went to Moscow, and they brought a 10-point plan, also implementable. Unfortunately, Switzerland, instead of playing its traditional role as a mediator, instead of offering its good offices for an exchange between Biden and Putin, or an exchange between the Ukrainians and the Russians, they played host to what I call a charade, an opera buffa, at the Bürgenstock in June of this year. I sent a very tough letter to our president. By the way, I'm not only an American citizen, I'm also a Swiss citizen, and I reside in Geneva. But I wrote to Viola Amherd that this was betraying the Swiss Constitution, what she was doing. And me, as a new Swiss, very, very upset to see Switzerland giving up its role as a mediator and giving up its neutrality and its credibility with it. Because what happened in the Bürgenstock was that they discussed a totally delusional 10-point plan produced by Zelensky. And how come are you going to have a conference for peace if one of the major players, Russia, is not even invited? I mean, it's dead on arrival. I mean, it's absolutely an absurd situation.
So why is this? Why do these nations, the Western nations like Switzerland and Iceland as well, has not been good at all in this respect? Why aren't they calling for peace conferences, for realistic diplomacy? You know, they're all just saying that we need to completely defeat Russia and exert our, you know, the Ukrainian and the American and French-German priorities, just completely dominate Russia. That's all they say. They don't focus on peace. Why is this?
No, not at all. I mean, they have betrayed their own values, actually, and their own history and their own traditions. The Swiss have allowed themselves to be placed under enormous political pressure from Washington, and evidently Iceland also. And I regret that very much, because Iceland could play a positive role in trying to negotiate peace. I think Iceland still has a degree of credibility, and Iceland could pull it off. And I think that the Russians would accept an invitation from Iceland. And by the way, I do know the Russian ambassador in Geneva, and I know the Russian ambassadors in various places. I know the Chinese ambassadors. I know how they're thinking. And they're certainly not going to go along with another show like this spectacle called the Bürgenstock in June. But I am very concerned about academia going along and repeating these propaganda words that have been put out by the Pentagon and by Washington. I reject that philosophy according to which we, the West, we Americans, by definition, are the good guys, and the rest of the world are the bad guys, and that we have a mission to bring democracy and human rights to the rest of the world. I mean, that is so preposterous, so arrogant, so ridiculous, that it's no surprise that the global majority in Latin America, Africa, and India are laughing at us.
Yeah.
And it's not going to get any better. And there are, by the way, and that is an element of hope, there are plenty of prominent American academics that are saying the right things. And when I say American academics, I name some very prominent professors, among them John Mersheimer at Chicago, and Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia, and Francis Boyle at Illinois, Richard Falk at Princeton, and Daniel Kowalik at Pittsburgh, Stephen Kinzer in Boston, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some very good non-governmental organizations that are offering their good offices for mediation. I'm pleased to mention the Geneva International Peace Research Institute. I can also mention the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities, in which I also worked together, and the TFF in London. And there are, of course, many other prominent academics in Europe who are saying the right things, among them Professor Glenn Deason in Norway, and Jacques Beau in Switzerland. He is actually Swiss, although he lives in Belgium. There's plenty of correct, accurate, reasonable, balanced analysis. And we're facing a barrage of public relations from NATO, public relations from the Pentagon, propaganda, just sheer propaganda, and by repetition. They keep saying unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. They keep repeating it. And they focus on war crimes by Russia. Of course there have been war crimes by Russia. But how about the war crimes by NATO? How about the war crimes by Ukraine? And as you may or may not know, the Russians have been collecting hundreds of instances of Russian soldiers being killed, Russian prisoners of war being killed, being tortured, civilians being targeted. Ukraine has a very nasty record here. And people seem to forget the illegality of the wholly undemocratic putsch against Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. That's when the war started.
Yeah, that's when the war broke out.
I mean, don't tell me the war started on the 24th of February of 2022. It didn't. It started 8 years earlier. It started on the 22nd of February of 2014. And it started also not only because of the putsch against the legitimate government, but it started because of the shelling of the civilian population of Donetsk and Lugansk, who wanted nothing else but just autonomy. Just leave us in peace. Let us speak our language, and let us have our culture, and let us have our traditions.
And this is enshrined in international law, correct? The right to self-determination.
Yeah, but that's not what you read in the New York Times or in the Washington Post or in CNN or in the BBC even. I mean, the narrative that we're getting day in, day out is false. And it's deliberately false. Mm-hmm. And they count on most people just simply believing it. And I say, reach out in the internet. There are plenty of other voices that you can access. Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal are very good. Aaron Mate, the Real News Network, Amy Goodman with Democracy Now! Mm-hmm. There are plenty of these alternative media outlets that give you the information that you are being deprived of. Because the New York Times is not so much that the New York Times lies. Of course it does. But so does RT, and so does CGTN, and so does everybody. It's not so much that they lie, it's that they suppress 80% of what you should know. And then they give you a narrative based on the 20%, which sounds plausible, and most people will believe it. But that is not going to get us anywhere except closer and closer to Armageddon. It's going to get closer and closer to nuclear warfare. Unless we in the West exercise our faculty of self-criticism and realize that we provoked this war quite deliberately. I mean, the plans already written in the RAND Corporation reports, and there have been two, on Ukraine. The idea was to use Ukraine to weaken Russia. The expectation was that Russia would collapse, especially through the sanctions regime, and that then there would be a regime change in Russia, and then the new government would play the game with the U.S., and then Russia would be dismembered, and the enormous natural resources of Russia would be at the mercy of the American transnational corporations. By the way, this is the same playbook as with Venezuela. People wonder why, these horrible sanctions against Venezuela, why all of these, the Southern Command of the U.S. Navy, etc., threatening Venezuela. Well, very easy. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. Venezuela has, I think, the second largest gold reserves in the world. Venezuela has such enormous natural resources that it is a bonanza for American businesses who would move in, because the first thing that a coup government, say if González Urrutia had been elected, and I don't believe it for a second that he won the election. I tend to believe that indeed Nicolás Maduro got 52% and that González Urrutia only got 44%.
González wouldn't even show up to the Supreme Court with supposed documents proving some falsifications.
The Supreme Court is the only instance foreseen in the Venezuelan Constitution to review disputed elections. I mean, when the competent authority, the Consejo Nacional Electoral, issues its report, usually that's the end of it, because they are the competent authority. But if you refuse to believe it, then you can dispute it in the Supreme Court. And for 3 weeks, the Supreme Court reviewed all the ballots. They did, the recounting, et cetera, et cetera. They came down with the conclusion that the results as published by the Consejo Nacional Electoral were correct. Mm-hmm. Now, the United States immediately rejected that. But imagine what would happen if China would say, we don't believe that Joe Biden was elected in 2020. We believe that it was Donald Trump. I mean, what massive interference in the internal affairs of the United States. Or imagine that Russia would demand to verify, to have a viewing of the election results in Florida or in Georgia Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, whether you like it or not, the buck stops somewhere. And usually the buck stops at the Supreme Court. Personally, being an American, having voted in the year 2000, I believe that Al Gore really won the election. I'm convinced that Al Gore won the election. But the Supreme Court stopped the counting and gave the election to George W. Bush. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to have a civil war? I mean, I don't like the result, but somehow you have to accept it for reasons of internal peace, of reconciliation. And I wish I had been Al Gore, because I think we would have been spared the illegal war in Iraq in 2003. But going back to our concerns today, the United Nations just completed 2 days of the so-called Summit of the Future, and they produced this document called the Pact for the Future. And my reaction immediately was, and I issued several tweets about it, forget about the Pact for the Future. There's going to be no future. I want to see a pact for the present. I want to see an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine. I want to see an immediate ceasefire in the Middle East. And when you read this 61-page document, you cannot but help that it is a cut-and-paste job. I mean, you read it, and it's the usual United Nations blah-blah jargon, which you know from countless resolutions. There's not a single original idea in this report. It would have been useful if the amendment that was proposed by several countries, including Russia, they wanted to include a text concerning the sovereignty of states, the sovereign equality of states, and recalling the international law obligation to refrain from interference in the internal affairs of states, which of course is also Article 2, Paragraph 7 of the UN Charter. And the amendment was not adopted. So here we have a rather useless document. I mean, the language here and there is good. I mean, they reaffirm our obligations under international law, including the Charter and its purposes and principles. Wow. They want to take effective collective measures in accordance with the Charter for the prevention and removal of threats to international peace and security, and revitalize and implement existing tools and mechanisms for the peaceful settlement of disputes. But how about talking about provocation? How about talking about escalation? How about talking about unilateral coercive measures? I mean, I've written a lot about unilateral coercive measures, which the United States wrongly refers to as sanctions. As you probably know, in international law, the only sanctions that are legal are those imposed by the Security Council under Chapter 7. Everything else is a unilateral coercive measure, which is an internationally wrongful act, according to the Code on Responsibility of States that the International Law Commission elaborated. They do not qualify under the exceptions. The exceptions are Articles 48 and 49 about what is termed retortion or countermeasures. That is, if country X violates the safety, the security of the mission of country Y, then country Y can respond in kind. That would be a retortion and tit for tat. So the first act is actually illegal, but the second act, the retortion, is legal because it is a proportional response to an initial violation. But the United States is not responding to any violations by Venezuela toward the United States. The United States quite brazenly wants regime change. The United States wants to ruin the economy of Venezuela, to create chaos in the expectation that the government would fall. And that's the same situation with Cuba. The United States imposed sanctions on Cuba, really draconian sanctions. And as the United States State Department itself admitted, the purpose of the sanctions was to have regime change, to have the government fall. The expectation was that it would impoverish Cuba so much, it would create so much unemployment, and it would force so many people to leave the country, because that's the link to migration. I mean, a lot of Cuban migration is not because they're against the Cuban government or the Cuban system. They have left Cuba, as Venezuelans have left Venezuela, because they lost their jobs, because the sanctions made their company go bankrupt, and there was nothing to do. Mm-hmm. So people have families, people have wives and children, they have to feed them.
We even have U.S. Officials like John Bolton stating this publicly, that the purpose of the sanctions on Venezuela was to create a migratory wave to destabilize the country.
Yeah, except that 63 years of draconian unilateral coercive measures. Note that I'm not using the word sanctions. 63 years of UCMs did not persuade the Cuban people to revolt against the Cuban government and to impose regime change. And why do I say we should not use the term sanctions? For the same reason that I object to the term unprovoked war. It's propaganda. If you repeat the word sanction, the connotation of sanction is that the country imposing the sanctions has legal and moral authority to impose them. The United States has zero right to punish anybody. The United States cannot punish Cuba. The United States cannot punish Venezuela. It is an act of aggression. And as I said earlier today, it has caused so many deaths that a legal brief was presented to the International Criminal Court saying that because of the tens of thousands of deaths caused by unilateral coercive measures, the ICC should declare them to be a crime against humanity under Article 7 of the Rome Statute. And of course they are. And the legal brief, which I have read, is extremely well drafted, extremely well argued. But of course Karim Khan has put it on the back burner and expects it just simply to go away. But he's not acting on it. And that happens very often. Not only Karim Khan, his predecessor Fatou Bensouda, and Fatou's predecessor Ocampo, there were legal briefs presented to the International Criminal Court for the prosecution of people like Tony Blair. because of the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in not only in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And there was no action on that.
And if I remember correctly, the investigation was dropped eventually.
Yeah, exactly. No, that it is. We ourselves are shooting ourselves in the foot because we need international law. And if international law is corrupted, if international law is violated with impunity, as it is, then you have the law of the jungle. And you have countries doing what you don't want them to be doing. And so we want to build a just world order, as I propose in 14 reports that I wrote to the General Assembly and to the Human Rights Council, and which I distilled into 25 principles of international order. The 25 principles are pragmatic, they are implementable, and all you need is political will. I'm not discovering the Mediterranean. I'm not reinventing the wheel. I am basing my 25 principles on the UN Charter, on judgments of the International Court of Justice, on countless resolutions of the General Assembly, notably 2625, the Friendly Relations Resolution, 3314, the definition of aggression, 60/1, the outcome document of the World Summit of 2005, etc. So it is solidly anchored in jurisprudence. But although it gets quoted, there's no country that has adopted them in order to implement them. And but even much greater academics than myself, when I think about the books and the plans of action elaborated by professors like Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs and Richard Falk and Francis Boyle, that have led to nothing. I mean, it's pretty shocking when you realize that very important books have no sequel. I mean, there are facts without consequences, and there are books without sequels. Take a book like the Guantanamo Diary of Mohadou Olan Sidi.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a book that will shake you up when you read it. When you realize the magnitude of the criminality of the Extraordinary Renditions Program, when you realize that he was tortured for 14 years.
Without charge the entire time.
And then sent back to Mauritania. And that book changed nothing. I mean, it confirmed what people more or less knew. He got great reviews, but government did not react. No one was ever held accountable for the torture. It's shocking. I think, for instance, of the reports by the United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, the Brit Benjamin Emerson, QC at the time and King's Counsel now. Well, Ben wrote a fabulous report in which he pointed fingers, and nothing happened. Things have gotten worse since then. So my dismay is not with international law. We don't need more norms. We don't need more treaties. My dismay is with the whole propaganda machinery and the public relations machinery of NATO and the State Department that make people believe that what the United States is doing is legal or legitimate, and so that they're being just. And that goes according to what I would call the philosophy, power is justice. Forget, objectivity. Forget what the constitutive elements of justice and balance and generosity would be. Forget that. Power. Power determines everything. Goes back to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War and the Melian dialogue, where the Athenian general tells the Melians, the strong do as they will and the weak suffer as they must. And then he proceeded to genocide the population of Milos. Well, one of the earliest genocides that we know about. Of course, there have been many in the history of humanity. So it's the old Machiavellian might makes right. And we dress it up in human rights jargon, and we claim that unilateral coercive measures are for their own good. We want to bring Venezuela to democracy. We want to bring Cuba to democracy and human rights and freedom of expression, et cetera, et cetera. The hypocrisy reaches levels that are really breathtaking, and the double standards. And we live in a world of double standards and a world of lawfare. I mentioned in the lecture earlier today the lawfare of Ecuador against the former Vice President Jorge Glass, and the unbelievable breach of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations when the president of Ecuador ordered the army to invade the embassy of Mexico and to physically take out, to kidnap Jorge Glass, who had diplomatic asylum, official. Mexico had given diplomatic asylum. So the case is now before the International Court of Justice for violation of two major treaties, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which ensures the safety of the mission and the embassy, and the prohibition, absolute prohibition, of entering the premises without permission. And number two, the Latin American Treaty on diplomatic asylum. Both Mexico and Ecuador are states parties to that treaty. And, these are such gross violations of two treaties that the International Court of Justice will have no choice but to find Ecuador guilty of violating them both. But the International Court of Justice is not apolitical. And the judges who are there are not there because they are great neutral professionals. I mean, anybody who gets appointed to the International Court of Justice is because there's an expectation, and usually a reasonable expectation, that he or she will toe the line, that he will take instructions from his government. So I suppose that the instructions now are just put it on the back burner, delay it. We don't need the resolution of this problem right now because it's going to go against us anyway. So just delay it. But that, again, diminishes the status, the authority, the credibility of the ICJ.
And this was maybe the primary concern of our meeting earlier, that can the United Nations become and remain in certain extents the guardian of peace and human rights in the world? And like you were speaking about these unilateral coercive measures that are taken by the United States on its own accord against nations illegally, while we're seeing the unfolding genocide in Israel-Palestine, and the Security Council unable to implement real legal sanctions, which should be implemented right now, because Israel has not paused its genocidal onslaught against Gaza with the opinions of the ICJ. Correct me if I'm wrong. The ICJ has come and said to Israel it must take better precautions to protect civilian life, and Israel has not responded. So the legal thing that should happen is that real legal sanctions should be implemented on.
Of course,
Israel.
the Security Council will not be able to adopt the sanctions because the United States and probably the United Kingdom and maybe even France would put in the veto. They are committed to protecting Israel, and thereby they have become themselves complicit in the genocide. They are guilty of violating Article 3, Paragraph E of the Genocide Convention. But the Security Council will not be able to adopt sanctions against Israel. What the General Assembly could do is, under a Uniting for Peace resolution, to take the matter up and to recommend to states that they break diplomatic relations with Israel and that they break commercial relations with Israel, that they confiscate, or not confiscate, freeze all Israeli monies in their respective banks. That would hurt Israel enormously. I mean, if we were to take this seriously, this would be the prime case for application of the responsibility to protect doctrine, paragraphs 138 and 139 of General Assembly Resolution 60/1 of 24 October 2005. R2P has been badly misused in Côte d'Ivoire and in Libya, but it was not used to protect the Palestinians. I mean, certainly if R2P has any meaning, the first place to apply it is Palestine, and it has not been applied. And I would like to see the Icelandic government demanding that R2P be applied against Israel and that the Palestinians be effectively protected from the genocide that they're enduring.
We saw just recently the Icelandic government with some other nations came out and said that Israel should be sanctioned, should be the diplomatic ties should be closed. The Icelandic government signs this, but they don't close they don't do what they say should be done.
Again, a number of countries, of course, have broken diplomatic relations with Israel, like Colombia. But if, say, 100 states were to do that, and more importantly, not just closing diplomatic missions, closing all commercial business with them, and freeze their assets, I mean, that would hurt. That would bite.
Mm-hmm. And that is supposed to be the utility of these sanctions in the sense of the international law, that they're designed to be able to exert, coerce nations that are very aggressively breaking human rights, killing people like we're seeing in Gaza right now. That's the purpose of these laws.
Of course, the weakness is that the General Assembly cannot implement its own sanctions. The Security Council can. Mm-hmm. And the General Assembly could make these recommendations, and then it would be for every state to adopt them or not to adopt them. But then the state would have this legitimacy that the politicians could say, we are following on the recommendations of the General Assembly. That means something, but I don't see any country taking advantage of it yet.
Did you see the South African foreign minister? I don't remember her name right now. She said a couple of months back that maybe the countries of the world should, bring their militaries, like a peacekeeping mission that the Security Council could send in if the Americans wouldn't veto it. She said that maybe we should bring our militaries together to enforce the food supplies into Gaza.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because then, what would Israel attack the military coalitions of?
Netanyahu is such a war criminal, and he's so completely out of control.
Yes.
That he's capable of attacking anybody, and my concern is that this might also lead to a nuclear confrontation. Just imagine if Turkey, that has a huge navy and a huge army, were to decide to implement R2P unilaterally in Israel. It could, or Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, or Iraq. Nobody talks about Iraq. But Iraq has an axe to grind. Iraq suffered so much under the United States and Israel that Iraq may want now to play a role. Iran, of course, but Iran is being very cautious at what it does. But if you had a major player like Turkey becoming involved, and if Turkey were to, through its navy, attack Tel Aviv or Haifa, then the United States would feel obliged to protect Israel, and then the United States might then get involved with a preemptive nuclear strike.
But in that case, Turkey would, have the, law on its side. Yeah.
Oh, of course, Turkey would have the law on its side. Turkey is also a rogue state. I mean, what Turkey did to Cyprus in 1974 was sheer aggression, inconceivable, inacceptable, but they got away with it. And what Turkey has done to the poor Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, that was Azerbaijan with the assistance of Turkey. Turkey has a very bad record. And of course it inherits the heritage of the Ottoman Empire and the genocide against the Armenians, about which I wrote a book, and the genocide against the Greeks of Pontus and the Greeks of Smyrna, and the Aldeo-Chaldeans, and I also wrote an article on the pogroms of September 1955, which annihilated essentially the Greek and Armenian presence in Istanbul. These are things that are very, very bad elements in the history of Turkey, of modern Turkey. But nobody talks about them. On the Palestinian dossier, Turkey has said correct things, but it has done nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, Turkey has joined South Africa in the case against Israel, but this is paperwork. This is what would really hurt is freeze their assets. What would hurt is stop doing any kind of business with them. And then Netanyahu might finally decide that he has gone too far and that he must implement the orders of the International Court of Justice.
Yeah. Ansar Allah, or the Houthis in Yemen, they've been blockading Israeli shipments in the Red Sea. by international law. They are, in a sense, doing what the Security Council should have done a long time ago.
Oh, indeed. And they have also suffered
Yeah.
because they have been badly bombarded by Israel. And I would like to see the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, call a spade, and to demand in his function as Secretary General of the United Nations, to demand sanctions against Israel and to demand an immediate ceasefire, et cetera, and not to waste our time with a summit for the future that talks about sustainable development. It just when you read it, it's so surrealistic. You say, what are you talking here? I mean, these are not the priorities. I mean, you're wasting our time.
It is so clear what is happening. You know, the ones who are breaking the law. It's very clear who's doing, who is the criminal party in this.
Absolutely, except good that you say that, because we both agree and we both understand that. But talk to a German. Germany has been subjected to collective guilt for the Holocaust and to such powerful propaganda in favor of Israel that German professors would look at you in the eye and say that the Palestinians are the aggressors and the Israelis are the victims. Oof. They fully reverse the roles, and the Täter, the perpetrator, becomes the Opfer, becomes the victim. It's absolutely surrealistic for that very reason. For 6 years now, I have not accepted a single invitation to give a lecture at a German university because it's worthless. I mean, I will have a student body whistling me down and calling me anti-Semitic because criticizing Netanyahu, criticizing the Israeli government, has now been converted into anti-Semitism, which, by the way, is criminalized. So not only do you have the problem of not being able to deliver your lecture, you have the problem of the criminal office indicting you for anti-Semitism and you having to defend yourself. Again, lawfare. And as I say, I keep away from Germany. I got plenty of invitations elsewhere. I'm going next week to lecture in Genoa and in Savona in Italy. And thank God the Austrians are not as mad as the Germans. I'm giving 3 lectures in Vienna end of October. But Germany has become a totalitarian state, has become an intolerant state, has become a dangerous state because it has lost its soul. Germans were obliged to go through the, shall we say, the self-humiliation of seeing themselves as the greatest criminals in history, as being the heirs of the Holocaust. And there were people as stupid as Jürgen, I've forgotten his last name.
Habermas, no.
Habermas, yeah. Who said that you can't write poetry after Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And I mean, this atmosphere.
And it's quite ironic in a terrible sense, where they're now, supporting another genocide and
absolutely,
really
it is
totally
ironic. They've learned nothing, and all you have is an atmosphere of terror. And I know it from friends who are professors in Germany that they have to be extremely careful not to say a wrong word that is going to cause them to lose their professorship or to have a legal proceeding started against them. Mm-hmm. So regrettable. I mean, I have my doctorate in history from the University of Göttingen, and I had lots of friends in Germany. And I must say, in the good years, in the 1980s and 90s and beginning of the 2000s, I must have lectured in no less than 40 different German universities. I had invitations all the time. Yeah. And I enjoyed it. I mean, I love German literature. You probably do not know that I was president of the Pen Club and that I consider myself to be a good Rilke translator, and my books on translating Rilke have done extremely well. And I just finished for Suhrkamp Verlag in used to be in Frankfurt, now it's in Berlin, for Suhrkamp, translating 220 poems of Hermann Hesse. People forget that Hermann Hesse was not only a novelist, he was a great poet. In any event, I translated for the first time into English 220 poems of a collection called Das Lied des Lebens. And now I'm just waiting, because obviously I sent it to the lector, mm-hmm. and they are going through them. Because, I mean, they would be silly and it would be unprofessional just simply to take them and just print them. Yeah. I mean, they'd better look at them. And I said, look, I'm perfectly happy. If you don't like my choice of words here or there, tell me which poems you want to have retranslated. I'll do it again. But I love German culture. I love German history. But forget it. I'm not going to lecture there because there is a clear and present danger of being arrested just for exercising the right of freedom of expression.
And for standing up against genocide. Alfred, thank you for your generosity of time. But there's one thing or two things I want to talk about before we leave. You stressed in the lecture earlier today that we need to fight against this, censorship that's increasing. These draconian, totalitarian measures, even in the case of Germany, where people are being arrested for waving a Palestinian a flag, and even
policemen going after children wearing a Palestinian flag.
That was horrible to see. And I know that in Facebook and these big social media companies, they are really upping the censorship, of content. I know that Ögmundur, who held the meeting earlier, invited you here. He was trying to share the meeting on Facebook, but he got, a couple of posts were removed for very strange reasons. So we're seeing this increasing. What do we need to do to resist this?
That is a big question, friend. Yes. I mean, I've been grappling with that very question for a long time. And my hope is the youth. You saw the young man who was there today. Mm-hmm. You saw the students at Harvard University who are doing now what I did back 50 years ago when I was a student and demonstrating against Vietnam. And the students at Columbia University, at Michigan, at Berkeley, the students seem to understand better than the adults what is at stake. And I'm putting my hope in youth activists who are not afraid of the consequences, although the consequences can be quite draconic. Mm-hmm. You might ruin your career. Mm-hmm. But they are doing it notwithstanding. And all I can say is I salute your courage in doing this. And I think that we, at least the adults, we have an obligation to write to our so-called democratic representatives and demand from them action against genocide. I mean, this is not a little crime being committed somewhere. Here you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people being killed before our eyes. Mm-hmm. We see it on television. So, yeah. And I think that there is very little action from the adults Apparently, only the students are doing the demonstrators. I would like to see not thousands, but millions of people on the streets. I would like to see a general strike to bring the government down. Say, either you break relations with Israel, either you break commercial relations with Israel, or we are going on a general strike until you do so. If they play hardball, we have to play hardball too.
They certainly are playing hardball against us. That's certainly the case. Not just with the genocide, but also just with costs of living and wages and so on. The time for general strike is
why does the cost of living go up? Because the money is being thrown out the window in useless wars instead of the money being used to create jobs. The money being used to improve infrastructure. There's so much to do in every single democratic country, but we don't have a democracy in most countries. We have a so-called representative democracy, but that means that you've given your vote to a representative who then is in the service of the military, industrial, financial, media complex. And then he does what his masters demand: more money for the military, more money for war, and no money to create jobs, and no money to improve your standard of living. I mean, it's quite a betrayal of the oath of office. But it is generalized. It's not only here. It is in Germany. It's in France. It's in Italy. It's even in Switzerland. And so I would call on everybody to be informed. The one war we can win is the information war. If we cancel our abonnements with the daily newspapers that lie to us daily, if we start getting our news from the alternative media, if we start quoting the alternative media, if we turn our backs on the lies and the manipulations of Wikipedia, then we can advance. It's crucial that people be informed. And people are, at this moment, very badly misinformed. They get narratives that are absolutely one-sided, and they cannot judge by themselves. So it is crucial that at all levels, parliamentarians too, that they be informed about the facts and the figures, and that they know who is the täter, who is the perpetrator, and who is the Opfer, who is the victim.
Very important, very good advice. That brings me to the last question and point I would like you to expand on. That we have these your book, the human rights industry, and these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the case of Georgia. Our foreign minister went there to participate in protests against a law that was supposed to limit or make foreign agents register their presence. Could you tell us really quickly about the human rights industry?
Well, I have a chapter on non-governmental organizations. I'm very much in favor of civil society and civil participation, etc. But the non-governmental organizations have been penetrated and are very much in the service of Washington and Brussels. For that reason, many countries have woken up, and they have actually followed the example of the United States. The United States has, since 1938, the Foreign Agent Registration Act, the FARA. And it's quite obvious that many of these non-governmental organizations are financed, if not fully, largely, by the United States, Israel, George Soros, etc. And their function is not to advance human rights. Their function is to destabilize the country. Their function is to create malaise, to create unrest, so that in the end, you have a situation like you had in Ukraine in February of 2014, where the legitimate, democratically elected president was overthrown by the mobs, and the mobs being financed by the United States, as we know from Victoria Nuland, who said that this regime change enterprise cost us about $5 billion.
Oof, yeah, and armed men in the parliament, making sure that the vote goes in the correct...
certainly the legislation in Georgia is legitimate, and I think it's a disgrace that an Icelandic minister or parliamentarian went there to demonstrate. Is nothing less than a disgrace. And he should resign for that reason. I think the United States has that legislation, and worse than any of the legislations that you have in Hungary or in Belarus or in Russia or in Georgia. And again, the double standards that the presence of a minister in Georgia, what that entails, it is quite shocking. And I must say, shame on him.
Yeah, shame on her. That's true. Because the Americans have the similar law, and it's a completely understandable law. Alfred de Zayas, thank you so much. We must keep informed. We must stand up for international human rights. Everybody deserves the same rights. We need to preserve the integrity of the international system to preserve peace and stability in the world. Thank you so much for your generosity of time and visiting us here in Iceland.
Thank you for inviting me.